Let's begin with a thought experiment, one first proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick over 40 years ago. Suppose there was a machine that could give you any experience you desired. Do you want to live in the mountains of Switzerland, the beaches of Hawaii, the Texas Hill Country? In the chalet, bungalow, ranch of your dreams? Done. Perhaps you'd like the love and affection of the most beautiful, attractive, wonderful, caring person in the world? Done. Maybe you'd like to cure cancer, eradicate poverty, end the war on terror. With the experience machine, it is all possible. Of course, the entire time you will be floating in a tank connected to hundreds of electrodes, but you won't know you're floating in a tank. You'll think it's all really happening. The simulated experiences inside the machine are indistinguishable from the real experiences themselves. You won't know the difference because there's no difference to know. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, that's all true while you're in the machine, but once you step outside of it, then you'll know it's all fake. Sadly, that's absolutely correct. And that's why during extensive prototype testing, we discovered that when people leave the machine, they are plunged into such a deep depression, the vast majority of them never recover. That is why, purely for your own safety, before you enter the experience machine, you must agree to remain there for the rest of your life. Are you ready to sign up? Well, for most people, the answer is a resounding no, and the reasoning goes something like this. We don't just want to feel like we're curing cancer or climbing Mount Everest. We want to actually do those things. We want to actually be those people. No matter how real something feels, there is a gap between something's feeling real and its being real, and that gap makes all the difference. To be inside the experience machine is just to lead a life in which one is floating in a tank. And no matter what that life might feel like from the inside, a life spent floating in a tank is a meaningless life. Fair enough. But suppose we ask a slightly different question. Would a person in the experience machine be happy? Now, for most people, that's a simpler question because of course they'd be happy, duh! Who wouldn't feel elation at the experience of climbing Mount Everest or curing cancer or basking in the arms of your beloved? Remember, the simulated experiences are indistinguishable from the actual experiences themselves. And now, because you'll never leave the machine, you'll never know they aren't real. Now, you might be saying, well, can you really appreciate and know happiness without experiencing some hardship? We encountered this problem with Experience Machine 1.0. And that's why in version 2.0, we're building in some obstacles. In fact, our technicians will make sure that the level of adversity you face is just enough to push you to your limits, but not so much that you would lose hope and give up. Your victories, which are guaranteed inside the experience machine, will taste all the sweeter because of the adversity you'll overcome. Try getting that guarantee from real life. Well, if this is right, then we have a problem, and that problem is the title of my talk. Earlier, we agreed that if you want to have a meaningful life, the last place you want to be is inside the experience machine. But now it seems like if you want to have a happy life, the first place you want to be is the experience machine. Is this the choice we face in real life? If I choose to lead a happy life, does that mean I undermine my ability to have a meaningful one? Or if I choose a meaningful life, does that mean consigning myself to a life that's less happy? Must we choose? What if we want both? Oh, golly, my time is done. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Drive safe. Do we have to choose between a happy or a meaningful life? Well, I want to argue the answer is no, but first I want to explain why it's so easy to think that is the choice we face. Happiness, so far as we've talked about it, is a kind of feeling, a kind of interior psychological experience. And interior psychological experiences have a very interesting property. They are completely inaccessible to others. You can never feel my happiness, and I can never feel yours. Now, it's true, we can and often do try to infer the interior states of people based upon their outward behavior. So if I see you staring at your feet, shuffling along, mumbling to yourself, moaning quietly, I'll infer that you're sad, but I'm not feeling your sadness. Now, it's true, I might be made sad by meeting you. Thank you very much. But even then, at that point, I'm experiencing my own sadness, not yours. So if the search for happiness is a search for my happiness, happiness inevitably turns us inward toward ourselves. In a very fundamental sense, your happiness is always about you, and my happiness is always about me. Meaning, however, does not work that way. Consider. Now, I'm going to give you the sentence in a minute, but I just want you to be prepared. All right? Here we go. Pretty clear, right? You know what that means? You're all thinking, no? That? Maybe we have just a bunch of sailors in the room. Is it this? I want to make 2 points. First, meaning. Whether it's the meaning of a word, a sentence, or a phrase, meaning can only be determined by a context. And second, context always exists outside of the word, the meaning, the phrase. You can stare at the word BOW for as long as you want. Its meaning will not and cannot emerge until you place it in a context, until you stop looking at the word and know what's around it. Similarly, for a life to be meaningful, you can't keep looking at the life. You have to see how that life is placed in a larger, broader context. Well, if happiness pulls us inward and is fundamentally about ourselves, but meaning pushes us outward and forces us to not look at ourselves, it's easy to think that this diagram is accurate. I want to argue that it's not, because it contains an assumption I think we would do well to question. This diagram doesn't simply say that happiness and meaning move in different directions. It says they move in opposite directions. And that's important because that means an increase in one necessarily means a decrease in the other. But suppose happiness and meaning just moved in different directions. What would that look like? Notice now happiness and meaning move in different directions, but they're no longer moving in incompatible ones. And I think if you look at this diagram, we can kind of immediately start to place lives that we actually encounter within it. So for example, you can imagine a life that is high in happiness, but low in meaning. If you'd like examples, I have 2 words for you. Reality TV. The defense rests. But we can also imagine a life that might be high in meaning but low in happiness. After her death, some of the letters of Mother Teresa to her spiritual directors were published, and even though she talked about the meaningfulness and the power of the work she did with the poor, she also spoke about profound periods of loneliness and sadness. But there's also a third possibility, a life that is rich in happiness and rich in meaning. What would a life represented by that green dot look like? Theologian Frederick Buechner, I think, would label that finding your calling. Your calling, Buechner says, is that place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Your deep gladness is about you, about what makes you engaged and alive. And so your deep gladness is something that you have control of. But the world's deep hunger is not in your control because you don't get to decide what the world hungers for. Finding your calling is discovering what it is that makes you feel alive, and then taking those gifts and skills and moving them out into the world to feed the world's hunger. Now, as presented, it sounds like a nice, neat, tidy package, but in point of fact, it's very difficult. It takes a long time to figure out what gives you true joy. And sometimes the world can seem so overwhelming with its incessant hunger that it's easiest to simply ignore it and focus solely on what pleases us. I want to close by arguing that that's not a very good thing for us to do. that in fact, the tension we feel between what we want and what the world needs is in fact something we don't want to eliminate, but instead we want to encourage and cultivate. In 2005, Stephen Jobs gave a commencement speech at Stanford University. And in that speech, he did not speak about his many successes and achievements. Instead, he shared 3 stories that all had to do with loss and failure. He talked about dropping out of college. He talked about being fired from the company he co-founded, Apple Computer. And he talked about contracting cancer. And how each one of those failures was instrumental in his later successes. Dropping out of college allowed him to study calligraphy. And that calligraphy then became a central feature of the Macintosh and made it stand out from other personal computers. Being fired from Apple allowed him to form a new company called Next Computing. And Next, when it was purchased by Apple later and Jobs returned, Next technology allowed Apple to revive itself and become a whole new and better company. And finally, by contracting cancer, Jobs said he realized that facing my own death, realizing I could die at any day, it made it very simple to figure out what was and what was not important in my life. When the world pushes and presses and prods and occasionally pummels you, it is in those moments that you can begin to imagine something different. You need the world and all its adversity just as desperately as the world needs you. I want to close with an analogy that I think will help you see how this kind of creative tension between what you want and what the world needs can actually be a valuable thing. And it's an analogy near and dear to my heart. This is a picture of my father, Malcolm Hébert. My father was a food and wine writer and a very, very good chef, as was my mother, Yvonne. You know, when I first went to college and I discovered that my roommates didn't know how to make a bechamel sauce or a souffle, my first thought was, did you not have a dad? Didn't every father teach their sons the basics of French cuisine? I want you to imagine that you are the chef of your own life, and your life is a series of meals that you must prepare and serve. Now, as a chef, this meal must express your tastes, your culinary vision. But at the same time, that meal must nourish and please others who may not share your tastes, who may not understand your vision. Sure, it would be simplest to just ignore them and to create a meal that just satisfies you, but a chef who dines alone is not a chef. The meal must be about you, but it can't be only about you. As a chef, you'll begin with a recipe. But every chef knows that recipes are just starting points. You have to taste and adjust and season as you go. Sometimes the pantry will be full, every gadget in the kitchen will perform flawlessly, and your guests will swoon at the meal that you create. But sometimes you'll be missing a key ingredient, or a burner won't light, or you'll cut yourself again. And your guest might utter those 2 words that strike fear in the hearts of every chef. How interesting. That is the moment when things go awry, when you are forced to change, that you will confront new possibilities you could not have seen otherwise. There's a story of a young kitchen apprentice who, after laboring over sauce for hours, realized it just wasn't coming together. So when the head chef walked over, she said, "Chef, I failed. My sauce is a disgrace." The chef leaned over, took a taste, and said, "Well, this is a terrible sauce, but it could be a wonderful soup." Turning a terrible sauce into a wonderful soup requires that a chef give up what she wants and embrace what she has, because that's the moment she can start to imagine she might actually want what she has. To lead a happy and meaningful life is to understand the tension that exists between what we want and what the world needs, and to recognize that tension as the gift that it is. Because it's only when the world doesn't give us what we want that we can begin to imagine something new, something we didn't even know was worth wanting. You don't find your calling in spite of the world pushing back against you. You find your calling because the world pushes back against you and helps you to see things you could not have imagined otherwise. And that is the moment when it's possible for your terrible sauce to become a wonderful soup. Thank you.